So going on about the fact that schools are in the public sector, do you think there's something to be said about big establishments and let's call them the elites wanting to control the education system? So just a thought experiment. If we educated everyone in schools about debt and about how credit cards work, you would expect that less people would be going into crumbling debt when they're older or as soon as they graduate from high school, and they'll know how to use and manage their credit card better. That, I'm assuming, would bring in less revenue for for the banks who make money off people having to pay interest on their debt and on not paying their card. So do you think there's something to be said about those incentives?
I mean, I definitely agree that it is an outcome. Whether it's by design, I guess depends on the situation. I have seen instances in the past, for example, where in some countries they want to change the history curriculum to suit the needs of a particular nation or some sort of narrative that they're basically propaganda that they're pushing. So that's definitely a factor to consider, and it depends which system you're under, which is why innovative education will do better in places where governments give the freedom to institutions to innovate and to do so basically to give parents and those educators the freedom to choose systems that make sense to the parents, and where government authorities play the role they should be playing, in my view, which is making sure that the contracts are upheld. So, the safety measures are upheld, the commitments that a school makes are upheld, and that parents have recourse. If someone promises you X, Y, and Z, and doesn't, just like any contract you make or any purchase you make, but doesn't dictate a particular curriculum. So I use the example of electric cars. If there are inspectors, there are government inspectors, and they play a very important role in the automotive industry, which is to make sure that cars match a certain safety rating. Like as a customer, there's no way you can know how a car will perform if it has an accident at 40 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, or whatever it is. And that's why having a government crash testing program is an excellent idea. As a manufacturer, you have to run some samples through those tests and prove that they meet certain requirements and they don't crumble and kill passengers at very low speeds, and you get ratings for that. I think that's an excellent role for a government authority. A second one would be emissions. As we try to reduce emissions, the government measures, what kind of emissions a car has and whether they meet the safety requirements and the emission reduction plans of any particular government. Where things can get difficult, let's say you've got an inspector, and I use this example for schools. You've got an inspector that is looking for your emissions, and for the right reasons. So I want to see what your emissions are, and you've built an electric car, and you say, there are no emissions. And if you have an inspector that needs to do their job, they're going to keep asking for those emissions until eventually you stick some sort of exhaust pipe on an electric car just to satisfy this inspector, because otherwise they'll fail your vehicle and you won't be able to sell it. This is where an electric car company would have to engage with the authorities and say, just so you guys know, crash crash testing, absolutely, we'll go through that, but we need an exemption for the emissions because, and here's the proof, we don't have an exhaust. There's no, there are no emissions. And if we've proven that to you, then we don't need this particular test. Same thing in schools. If you've built a curriculum where an inspector comes in and says, show me your grade 6 and your grade 7, and you say, well, actually, we group our students together into their psychological stages of development. So 6 to 9 and 9 to 12 collaborate together, and you have the 6-year-olds learning from the 8 and 9-year-olds, and you have the 9-year-olds playing a leadership role with the 6-year-olds and showing them how they master certain topics. An inspector that wants to see those specific grades will have a problem and could fail your school because it doesn't meet this particular requirement. Or they might have a requirement if they think that being high tech means you have an iPad in every classroom. For me, being high tech means you have a very solid understanding of math, cause and effect, logic. You have character, hard work, etc. And then later on, with that strong character, you play with the tools of technology. You use them. But bringing that in too early, for me, is not necessarily the right thing to do. So those are examples of there have to be discussions with the authorities so that they play the role that is very important, that they do play to protect the parents, to protect the schools as well, but that they don't then stifle innovation because they're expecting things to look like the traditional schools, especially if those changes need to be quite dramatic from what we have today.